fascinating book, Blood, Sweat, and Fear, exploring the story of Vancouver's first forensic investigator, Inspector John Vance, front and center in this book. Author Eve Lazarus joining us. Congrats on this book. I know it's been out for a while, but the interesting thing is John Vance was a huge name in the 30s and 40s, but this was a name in a contemporary era that most people didn't know about.
That's right. He's just been forgotten.
And you brought this to the forefront, the first forensic investigator here in Vancouver, but the VPD, they were a leader when it came to forensics and investigations. Why was this?
Well, it was almost serendipity. John Vance was a city analyst for the Vancouver Police Department and the city. And his job was mainly to make sure that the food and the milk and the water supply was all fit for public consumption. But he also had a background in toxicology and serology, poisons and blood, through working in the mines and his chemistry background. And I tracked him to his first case in 1914. It was a missing persons case in the West End. And police had found this suspicious-looking stain on the kitchen carpet, and they knew that Vance had a background in blood. So they'd brought him in to look at the stain and figure out if it was blood and not, say, red ink or ketchup. And this sounds ridiculously easy now in these days of DNA and things, but back then it was a hugely complicated process, and Vance had to do all these tests to make sure that it was blood, and then a whole series of new tests to see that it was human blood. And he determined that it was both, and police brought in the hounds, and the hounds went through the garden and the house, and finally ran down to the basement and sat by the furnace, and sort of, uh-oh, and police went down and shook out the grates of the furnace and found, pieces of corset and bone and a thigh wrapped up in the Province newspaper. And
just your average day at the office.
Found the missing person.
Incredible. And such compelling stories that are written in this book. And that compelling case from 1914 represents the blood in the Blood, Sweat, and Fear title. But 1934, also interesting, given how John's momentum with investigations had everybody's attention. 7 attempts on his life, but he was a warrior to battle against corruption. How big of a problem was corruption with VPD and City Hall back then?
Oh, it was huge. But in this case you're talking about in the 1934, he was so successful with his science that there were 7 attempts against his life by criminals, afraid to go up against him in court. And there were bombs under his car, there was a bomb in his office. Someone actually made a homemade bomb and sent it through the general office into the police department. And I was able to find a lot of the boxes that were packed away when he retired in 1949, and his diaries were a part of that. And he actually talked corruption in them and talked about the Chief of Police, John Cameron, being behind some of the threats on his life.
And what did you find as the most fascinating story or milestone when it comes to John Vance's contribution to forensics investigations and obviously solving some of these very difficult cases?
Well, I think what really surprised me was how far ahead Vancouver was in forensics. Like, Vancouver was the only police department in North America that had a forensic scientist on staff, and one of the few that used forensics in investigations. And just to give you an idea of how leading edge that was, it wasn't until 1932 that the FBI opened their first lab in Washington, D.C., and Vance had been on the job for decades before that. Like, we were really ahead of the curve here.
Well, it's good to see for Vancouver, an important story to be told. Blood, Sweat, and Fear, again, the name of the book. You can pick it up at evelazarus.com/blog. I love every place has a story. You're writing on the regular, and it's making a huge difference. So, Eve, thanks so much for coming by.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate the words and insight here.